Hi all, so continuing with our modular skill, today we're looking at methods of practicing. How do we practice certain skills? There are 4 different means of practicing skills: the part method, the whole method, progressive part method, or the whole part whole method, and each is quite self-explanatory in its way. So as we get started and we start to cram in a little bit more detail, make sure you're making notes, write down again any questions or queries you have, highlight things that maybe you didn't understand, that you might need a little bit more of an explanation within the lesson. So the part method. So within this method of teaching or method of practicing, a skill is usually broken down into its constituent parts. So it can only be done with skills that are low in organisation or low in complexity. So for example, we could go with swimming. So a swimming stroke is broken down into these parts: arm action, leg action, breathing, and body position. So you practice each of those parts individually, or you could just maybe within a session practice on arm action to perfect a certain part of the skill that maybe is a weakness within a stroke, and then you can put it back together later on. So the part method usually focuses in on detailed parts that are maybe a weakness, or certain parts that you just like to improve and develop a little bit further. The whole practice method. So pretty much as is said on a tin, the skill is practiced as a whole without any attempt to break it down into its subroutines or its constituent parts. So usually it goes with skills of high complexity, ones that are discrete, so you can't really stop them in the middle. Skills that are self-paced and started by the athlete, and closed. So for example, a golf swing is not really something that you can break down into parts, because as soon as it's started, it's pretty much finished. It's quite a quick action. So the whole practice method, looking at practicing a skill from start to finish without breaking it down at all. The progressive part method. So we know what the part method is, so you add a bit of progression in, and common sense, you're working on each part one after another. So learning or acquiring of a skill involves breaking down the skill into a series of parts before chaining them together one at a time. So easy example is learning a little bit of a routine. So for example, I learn part A, I then learn part A and part B and merge them together. I then add another bit on the end, so A, B and C, and so on, until I've learned and constructed together all of the different parts of that whole routine. So another example could be a tennis serve rather. So I practice the toss, then I practice the next bit, my racket swing, and so on, until I have the perfect serve as a whole skill altogether. And finally, again, what it says on the tin, the whole part whole method is a further development of the part method. If you remember, we said we could focus on those distinct certain parts of our skill that were a weakness. So it could be taken out of a whole skill, a part that we need to develop a little bit further before putting it back into the whole skill itself. So initially, a skill is performed as a whole, giving the performer the feel for the skill. They want to recreate within themselves the memory of how the skill feels as a whole. The skill may then be broken down into parts, and as we said, it could allow us to develop specific areas of the performance of that skill. So it could be, for example, the contact point of the ball when we serve in tennis. So what is my final follow through like of that skill? That's the only part you could potentially focus on. So as we said, it is important that they get a feel for the skill. So when they perform the skill as a whole, they get a feel for that skill. So once we've broken down things into parts, it's important that we do return to that whole performance to make sure the sequence of actions for the whole of the skill are linked back together, so that we feel the whole skill perfectly. So I know once I've completed that skill whether or not it'll be successful, because I know what the feel of the perfect action for that whole skill is. So it's important it's put back together so it's retained and stored in our long-term memory. So only a quick introduction today, those 4 different methods of practice. So there are obviously certain things that make us decide on which method is best. So there's probably reasons you can already think of as you go along. So if there's more that you think of than what we cover at the moment, by all means jot them down and bring them to next lesson. So after that quick introduction, so we know generally what each of those methods are. So what makes us decide which method to use? So the motivation of the performer, the experience and maturity of the performer, the type of skill we're practicing, and the environmental conditions, so how much time we have or the facilities that we have. So we'll give you an example. So if a performer is quite inexperienced or they're not very mature, so they're in the early learning stages in terms of learning a certain skill, you might want to use a part method, so they learn it little bit by little bit. So progressive part would be a good one of building towards the final performance of a skill. There's no point doing the whole part whole method with them, because if they can't perform it as a whole, there's nothing to be broken down. So lower level performers, inexperienced performers, think about doing it part by part. The type of skill to be practiced. As we said, there are certain skills like the golf swing that happen so quickly that you couldn't possibly split it into parts. So there are skills that have to be performed within a whole practice because they can't be split into parts. Time and facilities. So depending on how much time you have, you might not have the time to do the whole part and the whole method because you're restricted within a certain, so maybe it's mid-competition, in between a javelin throw, you just want to focus in on your athlete, the final release point, so that follow through of the javelin throw, for just an example. So because you're limited by the time, you just hone in on that specific certain part of the skill rather than getting them to do it wholly, then break it down into the parts and then get it wholly again. So different things look at allow us to be more kind of drawn to certain methods. So experience, the type of skill, and in terms of motivation, if the performer isn't motivated, you're not going to keep making them go through lots of different things all the time. So if you know that they're not highly motivated within your session today, you focus on that small part and get them out of the way. So once they've looked at all those factors, we said that then a coach can decide whether or not the skill can be practiced in its whole or in those parts. So in reality, we do really want all of the methods to be used at some point or another within a learner's career, because it's important they understand that they have to have a feeling for the whole skill, but there also are means of honing in and looking at specific parts of a skill to help them improve their overall performance. As we said, the different stages of learning allows us to access different methods of practice. So as we start performing a whole skill, we then identify areas of weakness, go into our part method of practice before we put it back together again to get our kinesthetic feel of the skill. In the same sense, as a learner, I start by practicing things in different parts. Once I've got all the different parts within a sequence, then I can look at putting the whole skill together and then going on to using the whole part whole method. So again, same as always, make sure you've made notes, know what all the different methods are, what kind of factors influence a coach's decision as to what method they're going to use within a practice. Write down any questions and queries you have and bring your notes to next lesson.